Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey to the winter darkness of the northern Urals, to a mountain slope where 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances so strange that over 60 years later we still cannot fully explain what happened. We travel to the Soviet Union of 1959, to a time of Cold War secrets and wilderness expeditions, to a tragedy that has spawned countless theories but no definitive answers. Before we venture further into this mystery, if you find these deep explorations of unsolved historical events compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you think happened on Dyatlov Pass. Your engagement helps make these investigations possible and supports continued exploration of history's enduring mysteries. Imagine the Ural Mountains in late January. The sun barely rises above the horizon, providing only a few hours of pale daylight. Temperatures plunge to 30 or 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The wind howls across barren slopes, creating snowdrifts that can bury a person in minutes. This is not forgiving country. This is wilderness where mistakes kill and where even experienced outdoors people must respect the power of nature. Into this harsh landscape, 9 young people ventured on a skiing expedition. They were students and recent graduates, fit and healthy, experienced in winter camping and mountain travel. They had proper equipment, adequate supplies, and a well-planned route. They expected to be gone about 2 weeks, crossing through the northern Urals and returning with stories of adventure and accomplishment. They never returned. When search parties finally reached their last campsite weeks later, they found the tent slashed open from the inside, abandoned in the middle of the night. They found footprints leading down the slope into the forest, some barefoot, some in socks, stumbling through deep snow in the brutal cold. And over the following weeks, they found the bodies, scattered across the mountainside and in a ravine below, dead from hypothermia and mysterious injuries that sparked decades of speculation. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, named after the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. It remains one of the most perplexing mysteries of the 20th century, not because we don't know how these 9 people died, exposure to extreme cold killed them all, but because we don't know why they fled their tent into the lethal night, what caused their strange injuries, or what really happened on that mountain slope in the darkness of a Siberian winter. So settle in as we trace the path of these 9 hikers from their homes in Sverdlovsk to their final camp on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, the mountain whose name in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a tragedy wrapped in mystery, a puzzle that has consumed investigators for over 6 decades, and a reminder that even in our modern world, some events resist simple explanation. To understand what happened on Dyatlov Pass, we must first understand who these 9 people were. They were not reckless adventurers or inexperienced tourists. They were serious outdoors enthusiasts, members of a hiking and skiing club at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg. They had trained together, hiked together, and developed the skills necessary for winter wilderness travel. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, the group's leader, was 23 years old. Picture him as his friends described him: energetic, meticulous, someone who planned carefully and thought through contingencies. He was a radio engineering student with a methodical mind. He'd led hiking expeditions before, including difficult winter treks. He understood the dangers of the mountains in winter and respected those dangers. This was not someone who would take foolish risks or lead his group into obvious danger. Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, called Zina by her friends, was 22. She was an experienced hiker, strong and capable, someone who had completed multiple difficult treks. She worked as an engineer and approached outdoor activities with the same systematic competence she brought to her professional work. Her diary, later recovered, shows someone excited about the expedition, looking forward to the challenge and the camaraderie. Lyudmila Alexandrovna Dubinina 20 years old, was described as the soul of the group, cheerful, enthusiastic, always ready with a joke or song. But she was also tough and determined, with considerable hiking experience. She kept a detailed diary of the expedition, recording daily progress, weather conditions, and the group's spirits. Her entries show careful attention to their journey and the landscape around them. Alexander Sergeyevich Kolevatov, 24, was the quiet one, serious, studious, focused. He was studying physics and brought a scientific mindset to their expedition. He'd been on multiple winter hikes and knew how to handle himself in harsh conditions. His friends described him as reliable, someone you'd want with you when things got difficult. Rustam Vladimirovich Slobodin, 23, was an engineering student known for his physical fitness and endurance. He'd completed numerous challenging hikes and had survived difficult situations in the wilderness before. He knew what exhaustion felt like, knew how to push through discomfort, knew when to rest and when to keep moving. This kind of experience would seem crucial for winter mountain travel. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko, 21, and Yuri Alexeyevich Krivonishenko, 23, the two Yuris, as they were called, were close friends and experienced outdoorsmen. Doroshenko was studying engineering economics. Krivonishenko worked at a nuclear facility and brought technical knowledge to the group. Both had extensive hiking experience and had survived harsh conditions in previous expeditions. Nikolai Vladimirovich Thibaut Brignol, called Collier by his friends, was 23. His unusual surname came from French ancestry. His great-grandfather had come to Russia during Napoleon's invasion and never left. Collier was an engineering student, athletic and experienced in winter sports. He'd completed multiple difficult hikes and knew the Ural Mountains well. Semyon, sometimes called Alexander Alexeyevich Zolotaryov, was the oldest member of the group at 37. He was a veteran of World War II, had fought against the Germans, survived brutal combat, and carried physical scars from the war. After the war, he'd become an instructor in outdoor education and mountaineering. His experience far exceeded that of the younger members. His presence in the group added an extra margin of knowledge and capability. Originally, there were 10 members. Yuri Yudin, 21, started the journey with them but had to turn back early due to illness. This decision almost certainly saved his life. Years later, he would speak about the guilt of surviving when his friends died, the burden of being the one who could remember them all as they were before that fatal night. Picture this group preparing for their expedition. They gather in Sverdlovsk in mid-January 1959. The Soviet Union is deep in the Cold War. Stalin has been dead for 6 years, but his legacy lingers. Khrushchev's thaw has begun, but paranoia and secrecy still permeate Soviet society. These young people are products of this system, educated, capable, loyal Soviet citizens pursuing adventure within the controlled framework of official hiking clubs. They assemble their equipment carefully. This 1959 gear is heavy, basic by modern standards, but adequate for experienced winter campers. They have a large canvas tent, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, skis and bindings, warm clothing in layers, cooking equipment, food for the journey. They pack systematically, distributing weight among the group members, ensuring everyone carries their share. Their planned route would take them northwest from Sverdlovsk, eventually reaching the settlement of Vijay by train and truck. From there, they would ski north through uninhabited forest and mountain territory, eventually reaching the summit of Otorten Mountain, and then return by a slightly different route. The entire journey would cover roughly 300 kilometers through wilderness, taking about 2 weeks. This was not an unusual expedition for serious Soviet hiking clubs of that era. Winter mountain treks were considered character-building, physically demanding activities that demonstrated Soviet youth's vigor and capability. Successfully completing difficult expeditions brought prestige within outdoor clubs. The hikers were pursuing adventure, certainly, but also recognition and the satisfaction of testing themselves against harsh conditions. On January 23, they departed Sverdlovsk by train. Think about that date, January 23rd, 1959. In the Soviet Union, winter is deep and dark. The sun provides only a few hours of weak daylight. Temperatures have been below freezing for months and will stay that way for months more. The landscape is buried in snow, forests silent except for wind and the occasional crack of frozen branches. This is winter at its most absolute. They travelled by train to Serov, then took a truck to Vyzhy, the last inhabited settlement on their route. At Vyzhy, they stayed overnight, preparing for the journey into wilderness. They talked with locals, checked their equipment one last time, and on January 27th, they set out on skis heading northeast toward their goal. For the first few days, the journey proceeded normally. They skied through forest, making steady progress despite heavy snow and occasionally difficult terrain. The weather was cold but manageable. Their spirits were high. The diary entries from these early days show excitement, jokes, observations about the landscape. This was what they'd come for: the challenge, the wilderness, the camaraderie of a shared expedition. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin's illness forced him to turn back. The group accompanied him to a settlement where he could arrange return transport. They said goodbye, probably expecting to see him again in a couple of weeks with stories to share. Yudin watched them ski away into the wilderness. This was the last time anyone would see these 9 people alive. The group of 9 continued northeast. They were now truly in the wilderness, no settlements, no roads, no people. The forest was thick, the snow deep. They had to break trail constantly, taking turns at the front where the effort was greatest. This was hard work, exhausting even for fit young people, but it was what they expected. This was winter mountaineering. Nothing about these conditions was beyond their experience or capability. Their diary entries continued, documenting progress and conditions. The weather was deteriorating: stronger winds, heavier snow, reduced visibility, but not dangerously so. Not beyond what experienced winter campers could handle. They were making slower progress than planned, but they were still moving forward, still confident. On January 30th, they began ascending into the mountains proper, leaving the forest behind for more exposed terrain. The trees thinned and eventually disappeared. They were above the tree line now, on open slopes where wind could reach full force and snow could drift into deep accumulations. Visibility dropped as wind picked up, creating what outdoors people call whiteout conditions, when blowing snow makes it impossible to distinguish ground from sky. They made camp that night in a protected spot in the forest. The last diary entry we have is from February 1st. It describes difficult skiing conditions, strong wind, deep snow. They were heading for a pass between 2 peaks. The weather was bad enough that they couldn't see far ahead. They were essentially navigating by compass and map, unable to verify their exact position by landmarks. At some point that afternoon or evening of February 1st, they apparently realized they'd veered too far north. Instead of reaching the pass they'd aimed for, they'd ended up on the eastern slope of Kolatsiakl, the mountain whose name means dead mountain in the local Mansi language. The sensible decision would have been to descend back to the tree line, make camp in the shelter of the forest, and correct their course the next day. But they didn't do that. Instead, they made camp on the open slope, about 1,600 meters above sea level, exposed to the full force of the wind. Why they made this decision, we don't know. Perhaps darkness was falling and they didn't want to navigate in the dark. Perhaps they wanted to maintain altitude rather than descend, only to climb again the next day. Perhaps Dyatlov, their experienced leader, judged the site adequate despite its exposure. They pitched their tent, cutting into the snow to create a flat platform on the slope. This was standard practice for winter camping. You needed a level surface, and cutting into the slope provided some protection from wind. They secured the tent, moved their equipment inside, prepared for the night. Everything about this process appeared normal. Their actions showed no sign of panic or unusual concern. And then, something happened. Something that made 9 experienced winter campers, warm and sheltered in their tent, suddenly cut or tear their way out of the tent from the inside and flee down the mountainside into the brutal cold of a Siberian night. Something that drove them to abandon everything, their warm clothing, their boots, their supplies, and run barefoot or in socks through deep snow away from their only shelter. This is where the mystery begins. This is where rational explanation becomes difficult. This is the moment that has consumed investigators for over 60 years, generating countless theories but no definitive answers. Something happened at that tent on the night of February 1st, 1959. Something so urgent, so compelling, so terrifying that these experienced outdoors people chose certain death from exposure over whatever threat they perceived. The tent would stand there, damaged and abandoned, for more than 3 weeks before anyone found it. By then, the trail of footprints leading away from it would be partially filled with snow. By then, the first bodies would have been discovered in the forest below. By then, the investigation would be beginning to reveal just how strange and inexplicable this tragedy truly was. The hikers had agreed to send a telegram to their sports club when they returned to civilization, expected around February 12th. When no telegram arrived by February 20th, their families and club members began to worry. This was unusual. The group was experienced and responsible. They knew people would be concerned if they didn't report in. The delay suggested something had gone wrong. Picture the families in Sverdlovsk in late February 1959, waiting for news. In the Soviet system, organizing a search expedition was not simple. It required official approval, coordination between multiple agencies, allocation of resources. The families pushed authorities to act quickly. The hiking club mobilized experienced members to help. Finally, on February 20th, search teams began organizing. The first search parties departed February 21st. These were volunteers from the hiking club, people who knew the missing hikers personally, who understood winter mountain travel, who had the skills necessary for wilderness search in harsh conditions. They headed northeast from Vizhai, following the route the group had planned to take. Simultaneously, authorities organized official search efforts. The military sent soldiers and officers. The local government provided resources. Aircraft were dispatched to search from the air. This was becoming a major operation. 9 missing people, all young, all connected to the Polytechnic Institute, all members of families who wanted answers. The Soviet system, when properly motivated, could mobilize significant resources. The weather was not cooperating. February in the northern Urals means continuing extreme cold, heavy snow, strong winds. Searching in these conditions was dangerous. Search parties risked becoming victims themselves if they weren't careful. But they pushed forward, driven by hope that the missing hikers might still be alive, might be sheltering somewhere, waiting for rescue. On February 26, after days of difficult searching, a search team found the tent. Imagine what they saw. A tent partially buried in snow, clearly abandoned, with cuts and tears that allowed them to see inside. Ski poles still upright marking the tent's position. Equipment scattered around the entrance. And leading away from the tent down the slope, a trail of footprints, now partially filled with snow but still visible enough to follow. The tent itself told a disturbing story. It had been cut open from the inside, multiple slashes through the canvas, made from within the tent. This wasn't damage from wind or animals. Someone inside the tent had deliberately cut their way out. But why? The tent's entrance was not blocked. They could have exited normally. Why slash the canvas? Why create unnecessary damage to their only shelter? Inside the tent, searchers found organized chaos. Sleeping bags, some still laid out, as if people had been sleeping in them. Clothing, boots, equipment, much of what the hikers would need to survive in the cold. Their food supplies, cooking equipment, cameras with undeveloped film, personal items, diaries, documents. Everything you'd expect in an occupied tent, except the people who'd occupied it. The footprints leading away from the tent were extraordinarily telling. Investigators counted 8 or 9 sets of prints, difficult to be certain because wind had partially filled them. Some prints showed bare feet, others showed feet in socks or light slippers. Some showed single boots, but none showed all 9 people properly equipped with boots and warm clothing. They'd fled into the deadly cold inadequately dressed. Picture this: you're warm in your sleeping bag in a tent on a mountain slope. Something happens. Something so urgent that you don't take time to put on boots. You don't grab your jacket. You slash through the tent wall and flee into temperatures that will kill you in minutes if you're not properly clothed. What could cause this reaction in 9 experienced winter campers who understood the lethal nature of cold? The footprints led down the slope toward the forest, roughly 1.5 kilometers away. The searchers followed them. The trail showed the hikers had traveled mostly in single file, walking, not running, apparently in some kind of organized retreat from the tent. This wasn't panicked flight. The spacing and patterns suggested controlled movement, but controlled movement while inadequately dressed into lethal cold. The contradiction was puzzling. The searchers reached the forest tree line and found the first bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, the 2 Uris, were found near the remains of a fire they'd attempted to build beneath a large cedar tree. They were dressed only in underwear. They'd clearly died of hypothermia. The fire had burned, but hadn't been sufficient to save them. Near the cedar tree, branches had been broken off up to 5 meters high, suggesting someone had climbed the tree, perhaps trying to see back to the tent or looking for a route to safety. These were the first confirmations that the hikers were dead. The hope that they might be found alive, sheltering somewhere, evaporated. Now the search became a recovery operation, looking for bodies rather than survivors. The reality of what had happened was becoming clear. All 9 hikers had perished in the cold, and the circumstances were deeply strange. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies over the following days. Igor Dyatlov was found partway up the slope, as if he'd been trying to return to the tent. He was about 300 meters from the tent, face down in the snow, frozen solid. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found further up, perhaps 450 meters from the tent, also positioned as if she'd been trying to climb back up the slope. Rustem Slobodin was found between them, also oriented toward the tent. 5 bodies found, 4 still missing. The question became, where were the remaining hikers? The search intensified. Soldiers and volunteers combed the forest and mountainside systematically, but the 4 missing bodies proved elusive. Days passed, then weeks. February turned to March, then April. Snow began to melt in the lower elevations, revealing what winter had hidden, but the 4 missing hikers remained undiscovered. The 5 recovered bodies were taken to Ivdel, the nearest town with adequate facilities. Forensic examinations were conducted. The doctors noted the obvious. All 5 had died of hypothermia. This was expected. What was unexpected were some of the specific findings, the questions these examinations raised, the details that didn't quite fit the simple narrative of people freezing to death. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, the 3 found on the slope, all showed signs of attempting to return to the tent. Dyatlov had grabbed a branch at one point, as if pulling himself up the slope. His body position suggested he'd been crawling when he died. These were people who'd realized their mistake, who'd understood they needed to get back to shelter and warm clothing, who'd tried desperately to save themselves, but couldn't overcome the cold's deadly embrace. The 2 Uris found at the cedar tree told a different story. They'd made it to the forest, found fuel, started a fire. They'd attempted to survive using the most basic wilderness skill: create heat, maintain core temperature, wait for dawn, or rescue. But the fire hadn't been enough. Exposed skin had frozen. Core temperature had dropped. Eventually, despite the fire, despite their efforts, the cold had killed them. Evidence suggested the 3 on the slope had taken clothing from the 2 Uris after they'd died. This made sense from a survival perspective. The dead no longer needed clothing, and the living desperately did. It showed the survivors had been thinking clearly enough to understand they needed more insulation. It showed they'd been willing to do whatever necessary to improve their chances. But it hadn't been enough. May arrived. The snow in the mountains was melting rapidly now. Water from snowmelt created streams and revealed what had been buried. On May 4th, searchers finally found the remaining 4 bodies in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, under 4 meters of snow. The ravine had apparently filled with snow over the winter, burying the bodies deep enough that earlier searches hadn't found them. These 4, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov, had apparently survived longer than the others. They'd made it to the ravine, perhaps seeking shelter. They'd been wearing more clothing than the others, some of it taken from the 2 Urals. They'd attempted to create some kind of shelter, or at least a more protected position. But eventually, they too had succumbed. Now all 9 bodies had been recovered. The physical evidence was complete, or as complete as it would ever be. The investigation could proceed to try to understand what had happened. But the evidence, instead of providing clear answers, raised more questions, because these 4 bodies showed injuries that couldn't be easily explained by simply freezing to death in the wilderness. The autopsy reports on the first 5 bodies had noted hypothermia as the cause of death, which was expected. Some minor injuries were documented: small cuts, bruises, nothing that suggested violence or unusual trauma. These were injuries consistent with stumbling through a dark forest in the cold, falling, bumping into trees. Nothing mysterious about them. But the 4 bodies found in May told a different story. The autopsy results would prove deeply puzzling, spawning decades of speculation and theory. These 4 had died of hypothermia like the others, but they'd also suffered significant traumatic injuries before death. Injuries that seemed impossible to explain through normal winter hiking accidents. Lyudmila Dubinina's body showed massive chest trauma. Her ribs were fractured, multiple ribs on both sides, broken with such force that the medical examiner noted it would require significant impact to cause such damage. This wasn't someone who'd slipped on ice or fallen against a tree. This was trauma consistent with a severe impact, as if she'd been in a car accident or struck by something with tremendous force. More disturbing, Dubinina's tongue was missing. The autopsy noted that her tongue, part of her facial tissue, and some bone from her oral cavity were absent. This detail would become one of the most sensationalized aspects of the case. Was the tongue removed before death? After? By what means? The medical report wasn't entirely clear, but it noted these tissues were missing. Semyon Zolotaryov showed similar severe chest trauma. Multiple ribs fractured, again with force that suggested significant impact. Like Dubinina, he'd suffered injuries that seemed inconsistent with simply freezing to death in a ravine. These were the injuries of violent trauma, of forces that broke bones and damaged internal organs. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a major skull fracture. His skull showed significant damage that the medical examiner noted would require substantial force to inflict. This wasn't a bump on the head from falling. This was serious cranial trauma that would have been immediately life-threatening. He might have survived for a time with such an injury, but he would have been severely impaired. Alexander Kolevatov's injuries were less severe than the other 3, but still notable. He had damage to his neck area and some other trauma. None of the 4 showed the kinds of external wounds you'd expect from such severe injuries: no major cuts, no obvious signs of being struck by objects. The damage was internal, the bones broken beneath intact skin. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, wrote in his report that the force required to cause Dubinina's and Zolotaryov's chest injuries was comparable to the force experienced in a car crash. He specifically noted that a human punch or kick couldn't generate sufficient force. Whatever had hit them had done so with tremendous energy. Think about what this means. 4 people have traumatic injuries suggesting massive force, but no external wounds suggesting weapons or impacts from rocks or trees. Bones broken with car crash force, but no obvious mechanism for such force. How does this happen in a snowy ravine in the middle of the wilderness? Some investigators suggested the 4 might have fallen into the ravine from above, and the impact with rocks or ice at the bottom caused the injuries. This would explain the force involved. A fall from height could certainly generate car crash levels of impact. But the ravine wasn't deep enough for such a fall, and the positioning of the bodies suggested they'd sheltered there, not fallen there. Others wondered if avalanche might explain the injuries. An avalanche can generate tremendous force, enough to break bones and cause internal trauma. If an avalanche had hit the group at their tent, it might explain why they fled. Avalanches are terrifying and dangerous. And if a smaller avalanche or snow collapse had hit the 4 in the ravine, it might explain their injuries. But this theory faced problems. The slope where they'd camped wasn't steep enough for avalanches. Experienced mountaineers can usually assess avalanche risk, and while they might misjudge, Dyatlov was considered competent and careful. More importantly, when searchers found the tent, it was still standing, still properly anchored. An avalanche forceful enough to drive the hikers from their tent would have destroyed the tent or buried it completely. The missing tongue presented its own puzzle. Some speculated it had been removed forcibly, suggesting violence. Others noted that decomposition and scavengers could account for missing soft tissue. Bodies left in the wilderness for months undergo various forms of degradation. Animals might have scavenged. Natural decay might have removed soft tissues. The medical report didn't definitively determine when or how the tongue was lost. What about the others? Did they show any unusual injuries? Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, noted in the autopsy, but not considered serious enough to be life-threatening. Several of the bodies showed minor fractures or injuries, but nothing like the severe trauma seen in the 4 from the ravine. The pattern was puzzling. Why did 4 suffer such severe injuries while 5 did not? Could the injuries have been inflicted by other people? This was considered, but there were problems with this theory. The area was extremely remote. The weather in late January and early February would have made travel difficult for anyone. There were no signs of other people in the area, no tracks besides those of the hikers themselves. And why would attackers inflict such specific internal injuries without leaving external wounds? The Soviet authorities investigated the possibility of involvement by the Mansi, the indigenous people who lived in the region. The Mansi knew these mountains intimately and traveled in them even in winter. Could there have been some conflict, some territorial dispute, some reason for violence? But investigation revealed no evidence of Mansi involvement. The Mansi who were questioned knew nothing about the incident. They had no motive for violence against the hikers. Some investigators noted that several of the hikers had shown traces of radiation on their clothing, specifically elevated levels of radioactivity on some articles of clothing. This detail would fuel speculation for decades. What could account for radioactive contamination? Was there some kind of weapon test in the area? Some kind of accident involving radioactive materials? Context is important here. This was 1959, the height of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union was actively testing nuclear weapons and developing various military technologies. Krivonishenko, one of the victims, worked at a nuclear facility. Could he have brought contaminated clothing? Could the group have encountered something radioactive in the wilderness? The radiation levels detected were not high enough to be immediately dangerous. They were elevated above background radiation, but not dramatically so. This didn't suggest a nuclear explosion or massive contamination. It suggested low-level exposure or contamination from some source. But what source? And how did it relate, if at all, to the deaths? The injury pattern suggested an event. Something had happened that caused severe trauma to 4 people while leaving 5 others relatively uninjured. Something with tremendous force but no obvious mechanism. something that occurred in the ravine after the group had fled from their tent. What could this something have been? The Soviet authorities treated the Dyatlov Pass incident seriously. This wasn't a minor hiking accident. 9 people were dead under mysterious circumstances. The families demanded answers. The public was aware and concerned. The investigation needed to be thorough, professional, and conclusive. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Lev Nikitich Ivanov, an experienced investigator who approached the case methodically. Ivanov and his team gathered evidence systematically. They interviewed Yuri Yudin, the survivor who'd turned back early. They talked to everyone who'd had contact with the group, the villagers at Vijay, the truck driver who'd transported them, other hikers who'd seen them. They examined the tent, the equipment, the clothing. They studied the autopsy reports. They photographed everything, documented everything, followed every lead. The investigation considered multiple possibilities. Could this have been murder? The evidence didn't support it. No signs of struggle at the tent. No tracks of other people in the area. The injuries to the 4 found in May were internal, without external wounds suggesting weapons. Murder by unknown assailants in the middle of winter wilderness seemed implausible. Could it have been an animal attack? The Urals were home to bears, wolves, and other potentially dangerous animals. But it was February. Bears were hibernating. Wolves might be active, but there were no signs of animal presence at the scene, no tracks, no characteristic damage to the bodies. And would an animal attack explain why the hikers fled their tent in such panic? Could it have been conflict within the group? 9 people spending days together in harsh conditions might develop tensions. Could there have been a fight that turned deadly? But again, the evidence didn't support this. The diary entries showed good group dynamics. The bodies showed no signs of violence between group members. And what group conflict would explain fleeing the tent together into the cold? The paradox at the heart of the case remained. Why did 9 experienced winter campers abandon their tent inadequately dressed when staying in the tent was their only realistic chance of survival? What could be so threatening that facing certain death from exposure seemed preferable? Ivanov investigated the possibility of secret military activity in the area. The northern Urals in 1959 were not far from various Soviet military installations. Could there have been a weapons test? A missile malfunction? Some kind of military accident that the hikers inadvertently witnessed or were caught in? Some witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident. Other hiking groups in the region, dozens of kilometers away, reported unusual orange spheres or lights in the night sky in late February and early March. These reports were documented but difficult to evaluate. Were they related to the Dyatlov Pass incident? Were they military activity, natural phenomena, misidentifications? The radiation found on some clothing raised questions. Was this connected to military activity? But the levels were low, and the pattern of contamination was inconsistent. If there'd been a nuclear accident or weapons test, you'd expect more uniform and severe contamination. The radiation seemed like a detail that might be significant, but might also be coincidental. Ivanov's investigation reached a conclusion that satisfied few people. In May 1959, he closed the case with a determination that the hikers died from hypothermia caused by a compelling unknown force. This phrase, compelling unknown force, would haunt discussions of the case for decades. What did it mean? What was the unknown force? Why couldn't the investigation identify it more specifically? The official file was classified and sealed. The area around Kolatsiakal was closed to hikers and climbers for 3 years. These actions fueled speculation. If the deaths were simply an unfortunate accident, why classify the files? Why close the area? What was being hidden? The lack of clear answers from the official investigation created space for alternative theories. Years later, Ivanov would speak more openly about the case. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, he gave interviews suggesting he believed something unusual had occurred. He mentioned the reports of lights in the sky. He hinted that he'd been pressured to close the investigation and classify the results. He suggested there were things he'd discovered that he wasn't permitted to include in his official report, but Ivanov was careful not to make specific claims about what had happened. He acknowledged the case remained mysterious. He admitted that his conclusion of compelling unknown force was essentially an admission that he couldn't determine exactly what had killed the hikers. Something had caused them to flee their tent. Something had caused the severe injuries to 4 of them, but he couldn't identify what that something was. The investigation had established certain facts clearly. The hikers died of hypothermia on or shortly after February 1st, 1959. They fled their tent on the night of February 1st under circumstances that caused them to leave inadequately clothed. 4 of them suffered severe trauma from some kind of massive force. No evidence of other people or animals being involved was found. Everything beyond these established facts remained speculation. The families were devastated not just by the deaths, but by the lack of clear answers. Igor Dyatlov's mother would spend years trying to understand what had happened to her son. Yuri Yudin, the survivor, carried guilt and grief for the rest of his life. He became something of a guardian of his friend's memory, attending commemorations, speaking to researchers, trying to help people understand who these 9 people had been. The classified files would remain sealed for decades. When they were finally released after the Soviet Union's collapse, they provided more details but no definitive answers. They contained photographs, autopsy reports, witness statements, investigation notes. Researchers could now examine the raw evidence themselves, but the evidence, even when fully available, didn't point to a single clear explanation. The official investigation, despite its thoroughness and despite the experience of the investigators, had ultimately failed to explain what happened. The conclusion of compelling unknown force was an admission of this failure. Something had killed 9 hikers in the Ural Mountains, something the investigation couldn't identify, something that remained mysterious even after extensive inquiry. This failure of the official investigation to provide satisfying answers has been one of the key factors keeping the Dyatlov Pass incident alive in public consciousness. If the investigators with access to all evidence, with authority to pursue any lead, with professional training and experience couldn't solve the case, then perhaps it truly was unsolvable. Or perhaps the answer was known but couldn't be officially acknowledged. Either way, the mystery persisted. Over the past 60-plus years, countless theories have been proposed to explain what happened on Dyatlov Pass. These theories range from mundane accidents to extraordinary events, from natural phenomena to military involvement to paranormal activity. Let us examine the major categories of explanation, beginning with those invoking only natural causes and ordinary circumstances. The avalanche theory has been one of the most persistent. Proponents argue that an avalanche or snow slab collapse hit the tent, either burying it partially or creating such fear that the hikers fled immediately. This would explain the sudden flight from the tent. Avalanches are terrifying and potentially deadly. It might explain some of the injuries avalanche debris can hit with tremendous force. Picture what an avalanche might be like in that situation. You're sleeping in your tent on a mountain slope. Suddenly you hear a roaring sound. The tent is hit by snow, collapsing inward, burying you. In the darkness and confusion, you can't find the entrance. Someone slashes the tent to escape. Everyone flees down the slope to escape the avalanche path. This scenario seems plausible until you examine the details. The problems with the avalanche theory are significant. First, the slope wasn't steep enough. Avalanche experts who've examined the site conclude the angle is below what's typically necessary for avalanches. Second, there was no evidence of avalanche at the tent site when searchers arrived. The tent was still standing, properly anchored, not buried under avalanche debris. The snow accumulation around it looked normal for that location. Third, if avalanche danger was the concern, the logical response would be to move laterally across the slope or slightly downslope to safe ground, then wait for safety or daylight. Instead, the hikers went down the slope all the way to the forest, over a kilometer away. They didn't stop when they'd cleared any potential avalanche path. They kept going until they reached the tree line. In 2019, a scientific study using modern avalanche modeling suggested that a specific type of delayed slab avalanche might have occurred. The researchers proposed that the hikers cutting into the snow to create a tent platform, combined with wind loading of snow above them, might have created conditions for a small slab avalanche hours after they'd pitched the tent. This avalanche, they suggested, could have damaged the tent and injured some hikers, triggering the flight. This theory gained media attention but faced skepticism from avalanche experts and Dyatlov researchers. The modeling made assumptions about snow conditions that couldn't be verified decades later, and it still didn't fully explain the pattern of injuries or why the hikers went so far from the tent before attempting to build a fire or shelter. Another natural theory focuses on katabatic winds, powerful downdraft winds that can occur in mountains. These winds can be extremely strong and frightening. Some theorists suggest that a sudden katabatic wind event might have collapsed or damaged the tent, created terrifying noise, and driven the hikers to flee. Katabatic winds can create infrasound, very low-frequency sound that can cause panic and physiological effects in humans. Infrasound below the range of human hearing can cause feelings of dread, anxiety, even panic. It can create physical sensations of pressure or vibration. Could the hikers have experienced infrasound generated by wind flowing over the mountain? Could this have created such intense psychological effects that they fled in panic, not thinking rationally about survival needs? This theory is intriguing but difficult to prove. Infrasound effects are real and documented, but would they cause experienced outdoors people to flee into lethal cold? Would the effects be so severe and persistent that the hikers couldn't recover their rationality even after getting away from the immediate source? And what about the injuries? Does infrasound explain the severe trauma found on 4 bodies? Some researchers point to paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where severely hypothermic people remove their clothing, apparently feeling hot when they're actually freezing to death. This is a known effect of extreme hypothermia. As core temperature drops critically low, blood vessels dilate, creating a sensation of warmth. People in this state sometimes remove clothing, accelerating their death. Paradoxical undressing explains why some of the hikers were found without adequate clothing. But does it explain why they left the tent inadequately dressed in the first place? Paradoxical undressing occurs when you're already hypothermic. These hikers left their warm sleeping bags and tent while still at normal body temperature. They became hypothermic because they fled inadequately dressed, not the reverse. Animal attack remains a possibility some consider. Could a predator, perhaps a wolverine or other aggressive animal, have entered or attacked the tent, causing the hikers to flee in panic? Wolverines are fierce and fearless. An encounter with one in a confined space might cause panic. But again, there's no evidence of animal presence. No tracks, no characteristic damage, no biological traces. Some theorists suggest that the hikers might have accidentally consumed something that caused altered mental states, perhaps contaminated food or water, perhaps ergot fungus or other natural toxins. Mass poisoning might explain irrational behavior, might explain why 9 people all made the same fatal decision to leave the tent inadequately dressed. But this theory faces problems too. The food supplies examined showed no contamination. There's no evidence of toxins in the autopsies. And would 9 people all be affected so severely and simultaneously? Would the effects persist long enough to prevent them from recognizing their mistake and attempting to return to the tent? Some did try to return, suggesting they retained enough rationality to understand they needed shelter. Carbon monoxide poisoning from their stove has been suggested. If the tent filled with carbon monoxide, the hikers would need to evacuate immediately. Carbon monoxide can cause confusion and impaired judgment, which might explain not taking time to dress properly. But the tent was not completely enclosed, it had ventilation, and carbon monoxide effects would dissipate quickly in open air. Once outside, The hikers should have regained clear thinking. Each natural explanation accounts for some aspects of the case but fails to explain others. Avalanche doesn't explain the injuries or the distance traveled. Infrasound doesn't explain the severe trauma. Animal attack has no evidence. Poisoning has no evidence. Carbon monoxide doesn't explain continued irrational behavior after leaving the tent. The natural explanations, while avoiding exotic scenarios, struggle to account for all the evidence. Perhaps the answer isn't a single cause, but a combination. Perhaps the tent was damaged by wind, and in the confusion and cold, the hikers made poor decisions that cascaded into tragedy. Perhaps there was a minor avalanche that injured some and frightened all, and then hypothermia and injuries in the ravine created the rest of the tragedy. Perhaps multiple factors combined in a perfect storm of bad circumstances. But even combination theories struggle with the basic paradox. Why did experienced winter campers make such fundamentally poor survival decisions? Why abandon shelter when shelter is survival? Why not attempt to recover equipment or clothing? Why go so far from the tent before attempting to create warmth or shelter? These questions resist easy natural explanations. The Cold War context of 1959 cannot be ignored when examining the Dyatlov Pass incident. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in nuclear competition and military rivalry. Both nations were developing new weapons, testing missiles, conducting secret operations. The northern Urals, while remote, were not far from various military installations. Could the hikers have encountered something they shouldn't have? The weapons test theory suggests the hikers were accidentally killed or injured by military testing, perhaps a missile gone off course, perhaps a new weapon being evaluated, perhaps some kind of explosion or chemical release. The immediate classification of the investigation files, the closure of the area to civilians, the reports of strange lights in the sky, all these factors fuel speculation about military involvement. Picture the scenario. A military test is scheduled for the remote northern Urals, an area assumed to be uninhabited in winter. But unknown to the military, 9 hikers are camping on a mountainside. Something goes wrong with the test. Maybe a missile malfunctions and explodes near the hikers. Maybe they're exposed to some kind of weapon effect, chemicals, radiation, pressure waves. They flee in panic. Some are injured. All eventually die in the cold. If this happened, the Soviet military would have strong motivation to conceal it. Admitting that a weapons test killed Soviet citizens would be embarrassing and politically dangerous. Better to classify everything, close the area, and let the incident become a mystery than to acknowledge military responsibility. The compelling unknown force determination could be Ivanov's way of recording the truth while not explicitly stating it. But this theory has problems. There's no concrete evidence of weapons testing in that specific area at that specific time. The injuries don't clearly match any known weapon effects. If there'd been an explosion, you'd expect blast effects, burns, shrapnel wounds. If there'd been chemical exposure, you'd expect specific symptoms. The evidence doesn't clearly point to weapon involvement. The radiation detected on clothing is cited as evidence of military involvement. Perhaps the hikers encountered radioactive materials from a nuclear accident or weapons program. Perhaps they witnessed something at a nuclear facility and were carrying contaminated clothing. But the radiation levels were low and the contamination pattern inconsistent with direct exposure to a nuclear event. Some theorists point to Krivonishenko's work at the Mayak nuclear facility, one of the Soviet Union's main nuclear weapons production sites. Could he have brought contaminated clothing on the trip? Could the group have encountered something related to nuclear materials? Mayak had suffered a serious accident in 1957, releasing significant radiation. Could there be some connection? But contamination from Mayak wouldn't explain the deaths. The radiation levels found weren't high enough to cause immediate harm. And if nuclear radiation was the threat, why would the hikers flee their tent? Radiation is invisible and odorless. You can't tell you're being exposed. There'd be no reason to panic and flee immediately. The radiation seems like a detail that might be related or might be coincidental, but it doesn't explain the immediate circumstances of death. Parachute mine theory is another military scenario. Some researchers suggest that the hikers might have encountered unexploded ordnance, perhaps parachute mines from World War II or later Soviet military exercises. These mines could have been sitting dormant in the snow for years. If the hikers accidentally triggered one, the explosion might explain the injuries and the panic. This theory has some appeal. A sudden explosion would cause immediate panic and flight. Blast pressure and flying debris could cause internal injuries without major external wounds. The explosion might explain the severe chest trauma seen in Dubinina and Zolotaryov. Blast pressure can break ribs without leaving external marks. But where's the evidence of explosion? Where's the crater, the blast damage, the explosive residue? Secret military facility theory suggests the hikers might have accidentally approached or observed a classified installation. Guards or soldiers, seeing intruders, might have forced them from their tent and pursued them. The severe injuries might be from military violence. The cover-up would be to protect the facility's secrecy, but this seems implausible. The area was extremely remote. Why would a secret facility be so poorly protected that hikers could accidentally approach it? And if military personnel were involved, why not simply detain the hikers or escort them away? Why create a situation that left 9 civilians dead and sparked an investigation? The Soviet military was ruthless, but they weren't typically incompetent in ways that would create this kind of attention-attracting incident. Some theorists suggest thermobaric weapon testing. Thermobaric weapons, also called vacuum bombs or fuel-air explosives, create devastating pressure waves that can cause severe internal injuries without external damage. A thermobaric explosion in the valley might have created pressure effects that injured the hikers, caused panic, and led to their flight and deaths. This theory accounts for the specific pattern of injuries, internal trauma, without external wounds. It explains the sudden panic and flight. It provides a reason for military secrecy and classification. But did the Soviet Union have thermobaric weapons in 1959? Were they testing them in the Urals? There's no documented evidence of such testing at that time and place. Low-frequency sound weapons are another possibility raised by some theorists. If the military was testing weapons that generated infrasound or other acoustic effects, this might explain reports of strange noises, might cause physiological effects that drove the hikers from their tent, might even contribute to injuries through sound pressure. But again, evidence is lacking, and the effects don't perfectly match the observed injuries. The classification of the investigation file is often cited as evidence of military involvement. If this was simply a hiking accident, why classify anything? The classification and the closure of the area suggest something was being hidden. But what exactly? Soviet authorities classified many things for reasons that might seem excessive by Western standards. Classification doesn't prove military involvement, it just proves the authorities wanted to control information. In recent years, as more information has become available after the Soviet collapse, no smoking gun has emerged to prove military involvement. No documents admitting to weapons tests in the area. No records of classified operations that killed civilians. No deathbed confessions from military personnel who were involved. If the military was responsible, they've kept the secret completely. The military theory remains popular because it provides a neat explanation. The government knows what happened, but can't or won't admit it. The classification and secrecy make sense if there's something to hide. The strange lights in the sky, the radiation, the severe injuries all can be explained by military activity. But without concrete evidence, it remains speculation, plausible perhaps, but unproven. Perhaps the truth involves military presence without military responsibility. Perhaps there was military activity in the area, tests, exercises, patrols. Perhaps the hikers saw or heard things that made them nervous. Perhaps the authorities classified the investigation not because they were responsible for the deaths, but because they didn't want to admit what military activities were occurring in the region. The secrecy might be about protecting military secrets rather than covering up military guilt. When conventional explanations struggle to account for all evidence, people turn to more extraordinary theories. The Dyatlov Pass incident has attracted its share of exotic explanations, some based on misunderstood natural phenomena, some venturing into the paranormal or extraterrestrial. While these theories often lack evidence, they reflect the case's persistent resistance to simple explanation. The Yeti, or abominable snowman theory, has been proposed by some. The Urals are remote and wild. Local Mansi legends speak of various dangerous spirits and creatures. Could the hikers have encountered something unknown, some large predator or undiscovered species that attacked them or drove them from their tent in terror? This theory appeals to our sense of the mysterious wilderness harboring unknown things. The remote mountains could conceivably hide rare or undiscovered animals. Large predators would explain sudden panic and flight. But there's no physical evidence, no tracks, no fur or tissue, no characteristic damage to bodies. And would a predator attack explain the specific pattern of injuries seen in the ravine victims? UFO and extraterrestrial theories point to the reports of strange lights in the sky. Multiple witnesses in the region reported seeing unusual orange spheres or lights around the time of the incident. Could these have been UFOs? Could the hikers have encountered something extraterrestrial on the mountain? Could alien involvement explain the mysterious circumstances? These theories often cite the radiation as evidence of advanced technology. They point to the compelling unknown force determination as a hint that something beyond current understanding was involved. They suggest the severe internal injuries might be from energy weapons or other exotic technology. The lack of conventional explanation is taken as evidence of unconventional causes, but UFO theories face the same problem as all exotic theories' lack of concrete evidence. The lights in the sky could have been meteors, military rockets, or other mundane phenomena. Orange lights are sometimes reported during unusual weather or atmospheric conditions. Without physical evidence of extraterrestrial presence, UFO involvement remains speculation based on gaps in conventional explanation rather than positive evidence. Ball lightning is a rare and not fully understood natural phenomenon, glowing spheres of light that appear during thunderstorms or unusual atmospheric conditions. Some theorists suggest ball lightning might have entered or approached the tent, causing panic and possibly causing injuries through electrical discharge or other effects. Ball lightning is real but poorly understood. It can appear as glowing orbs, can move unpredictably, and can cause unusual effects. If ball lightning appeared at the tent, it might have caused sufficient panic to drive the hikers out. But ball lightning typically appears during thunderstorms, and there's no indication of a storm on February 1st. And would ball lightning explain the severe crush injuries? Infrasound from natural sources has been proposed. Wind flowing over certain terrain features can generate low-frequency sound that causes panic, anxiety, and physiological effects in humans. The mountain topography might have created conditions for infrasound generation. Could this have affected the hikers' mental states, causing irrational decisions? This theory has more scientific grounding than Yeti or UFOs. Infrasound effects are documented. The psychological and physiological impacts are real. But would the effects be severe enough to cause 9 experienced people to make such fundamental survival mistakes? And would infrasound explain the severe injuries found on 4 bodies? Some theories invoke government experiments on the hikers themselves, perhaps testing the effects of psychological weapons, perhaps exposing them to chemical or biological agents, perhaps using them as unwitting guinea pigs. This would explain government secrecy and classification. It would provide a reason why the investigation couldn't reveal the truth. But these theories require believing the Soviet government would deliberately kill 9 of its own citizens in a remote experiment, then conduct an investigation that generated publicity rather than quietly disappearing the bodies and erasing any record. It seems incompatible with how such experiments would be conducted if they occurred at all. Paranormal theories suggest supernatural involvement, hostile spirits, curses, mysterious energies. The Mansi name for the mountain Dead Mountain is sometimes cited as evidence that locals knew the area was dangerous or haunted. Perhaps the hikers disturbed something, encountered something beyond normal understanding. These theories can't be scientifically evaluated. If you accept the premise that supernatural forces exist and can kill people, then paranormal involvement becomes possible. But there's no way to prove or disprove such claims. They exist outside the framework of evidence-based investigation. They're more about belief than about explanation. Time slip or temporal anomaly theories suggest the hikers might have encountered some kind of localized distortion in space-time, perhaps experiencing time differently or partially phasing into another reality. These theories typically come from people with limited understanding of physics, using scientific-sounding language to describe impossible scenarios. The appeal of extraordinary theories lies in the case's genuine strangeness. When natural explanations struggle, when military explanations lack evidence, when the mystery persists despite investigation, people turn to more exotic possibilities. Each extraordinary theory reflects some aspect of the case that seems to defy ordinary explanation. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The burden of proof is higher when proposing UFOs or Yeti than when proposing avalanche or military accident, and no extraordinary theory has provided compelling physical evidence. They remain speculation based on gaps in knowledge, rather than positive evidence of exotic causes. Perhaps the very persistence of extraordinary theories tells us something important about the case. They persist because the conventional explanations remain unsatisfying. Each natural or military theory accounts for some evidence, but struggles with other evidence. The case resists simple explanation, creating space for theories that match its strangeness. But the fact that conventional explanations are incomplete doesn't mean unconventional explanations are correct. Sometimes the answer is simply that we don't know. Sometimes evidence is insufficient or lost to time. Sometimes tragedy occurs through unfortunate combinations of circumstances that leave ambiguous traces. Mystery doesn't require exotic explanations. It might just require accepting that some questions lack definitive answers. The Dyatlov Pass incident has never faded from public consciousness. As decades passed and the Soviet Union collapsed, interest in the case grew rather than diminished. New generations of investigators, freed from Soviet-era restrictions, have re-examined the evidence, conducted their own research, and proposed new explanations. The case has become a permanent fixture in the catalogue of unsolved mysteries. The release of the investigation files after the Soviet collapse allowed researchers to examine primary documents for the first time. Photographs, autopsy reports, witness statements, investigation notes all became available. This transparency revealed new details, but also confirmed that the original investigation had been reasonably thorough. The mystery wasn't from lack of evidence or poor investigation. The mystery was inherent in the evidence itself. Numerous expeditions have visited the site over the decades. Researchers have camped on the same slope where the hikers died, attempting to understand conditions and circumstances firsthand. They've measured slopes, assessed avalanche potential, examined wind patterns, experienced the cold and isolation. These expeditions have provided valuable insights into what the hikers faced, even if they haven't solved the mystery. Modern forensic analysis has been applied to the old evidence. Contemporary pathologists have reviewed the autopsy reports, offering interpretations based on current medical knowledge. The conclusions remain controversial. Some experts argue the injuries could result from natural causes: falls, crushing by snow. Others maintain the injury patterns are unusual and difficult to explain conventionally. Computer modeling and simulation have been used to test various theories. Avalanche researchers created models of the slope and snow conditions, testing whether avalanches were possible. Their work suggested that a specific type of delayed slab avalanche might have occurred, though this remains disputed. Other researchers have modeled wind patterns and sound propagation, testing infrasound theories. The 2019 avalanche study by Swiss researchers generated significant media attention. Using modern snow mechanics and computer simulation, they argued that a slab avalanche could have occurred hours after the tent was pitched, caused by wind loading and the cutting into the slope for the tent platform. The delay would explain why the avalanche wasn't immediate. This study's findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal, giving them scientific credibility. But critical responses noted that the model required assuming specific snow conditions that couldn't be verified decades later. It also didn't fully explain why the hikers went so far from the tent or account for all injury patterns. The study advanced understanding but didn't achieve consensus. In 2020, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, conducting new assessments of the evidence. This wasn't a full reinvestigation, but rather a review to determine which of the various theories best fit the evidence. The conclusion favored avalanche as the most likely explanation, though acknowledging uncertainties remained. The 2020 conclusion satisfied some observers but not others. Critics argued the authorities wanted closure and picked the most plausible natural explanation without fully addressing all evidence. Supporters argued that avalanche, while imperfect as an explanation, required fewer assumptions than exotic theories. The debate continues. Television documentaries have extensively covered the case. Each brings new perspectives, new experts, new theories. The production quality and thoroughness vary. Some are serious investigations, others are sensationalized mysteries designed for entertainment. Together, they've kept the case in public consciousness and introduced it to new audiences. Internet forums and discussion groups have become hubs for Dyatlov research. Enthusiasts worldwide share theories, debate evidence, and analyze details. This crowdsourced investigation has both strengths and weaknesses. It brings diverse perspectives and fresh thinking, but it also amplifies unlikely theories and creates echo chambers where questionable ideas gain unwarranted credibility. The case has inspired books, films, and fictionalized accounts. Some are serious attempts to understand what happened. Others use the incident as backdrop for horror or thriller narratives. This cultural presence has made Dyatlov Pass a recognizable reference even for people unfamiliar with the actual details of the case. Modern technology has enabled new forms of investigation. Satellite imagery shows the terrain in detail. Weather data from 1959 has been digitized and analyzed. Computer databases allow systematic comparison of the Dyatlov incident to other outdoor tragedies. Technology aids investigation but hasn't yet provided definitive answers. Some researchers focus on psychological aspects. What would cause a group to make such catastrophically poor survival decisions? Can group psychology explain mass panic or irrational choices? Are there documented cases of similar behavior in other wilderness emergencies? Understanding human behavior in extreme stress might illuminate what happened. Studies of other cold-weather outdoor tragedies provide some context. Deaths from hypothermia often involve counterintuitive behaviors. People make poor decisions when cold and tired. Panic can override survival training. The unique aspects of the Dyatlov case might actually be less unique than they first appear when examined in context of many wilderness deaths. But comparison to other cases also highlights what makes Dyatlov unusual. Most hypothermia deaths involve people who became lost, exhausted, or incapacitated. The Dyatlov hikers weren't lost. They knew where their tent was. They weren't exhausted. They just made camp and presumably rested. They weren't incapacitated. They were able to walk and had started a fire. Something specific drove them from shelter. The memorial on Dyatlov Pass marks the site of the tragedy. Hikers who complete the trek often leave tokens, pay respects, contemplate what happened. The mountain has become a kind of pilgrimage site for those interested in the mystery. The physical place connects the modern investigation to the actual events in a way that photographs and documents cannot. Yuri Yudin, the survivor who turned back early, lived until 2012. Throughout his life, he fielded questions about the incident, attended memorials, supported research into what happened. His perspective was unique. He knew the hikers personally, understood their capabilities, was there for the beginning of the journey. His death closed a direct link to the events. The families of the victims have had to live with the uncertainty. Not knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones adds an extra dimension of grief. Some families have supported ongoing investigation, hoping eventual answers might bring closure. Others have preferred to let the past rest, finding peace in remembering their lost family members rather than obsessing over the circumstances of death. Modern investigators face a fundamental challenge. The physical evidence is 60+ years old, degraded, and in many cases no longer available for re-examination. The bodies have been buried for decades. The equipment and clothing were dispersed or deteriorated. The site has been visited by countless people, obliterating any traces that might have persisted. We're investigating through documents and photographs, not direct examination. This distance from the primary evidence means certainty is probably impossible. We can't retest the radiation with modern instruments. We can't re-examine the injuries with modern forensic tools. We can't ask the investigators questions about details they might have noticed but didn't record. The investigation is frozen in the tools and techniques of 1959, yet interest continues undiminished. New theories emerge regularly. Researchers find new angles to explore, new connections to draw, new interpretations of old evidence. The case seems inexhaustible, generating endless analysis and speculation. Perhaps this persistence reflects something deeper than simple curiosity. Perhaps it speaks to our need to believe that mysteries can be solved, that tragedies have explanations, that understanding is always possible. Amid all the theories and speculation, it's easy to lose sight of the most important fact. 9 real people died on that mountain. They were not characters in a mystery story. They were individuals with families, friends, dreams, and futures that were cut short. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, students and workers, people who laughed and argued and fell in love and made plans. Before they became a mystery, they were simply young people on a hiking trip. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, was remembered by friends as someone who took responsibility seriously. He planned carefully, considered contingencies, looked after his team. His decision to camp on the exposed slope has been questioned endlessly, but in the context of his experience and judgment, it apparently seemed reasonable at the time. He died trying to return to the tent, trying to correct what had gone wrong, trying to save himself and perhaps others. Zinaida Kolmogorova kept a diary of the expedition, documenting their journey with care and enthusiasm. Her entries show someone who loved the wilderness, who found joy in physical challenge, who valued the camaraderie of the group. She wrote about the weather, the landscape, small incidents along the way. Her words give us a window into the trip before tragedy struck, showing us the adventure as the hikers experienced it. Lyudmila Dubinina was known for her spirit and energy. Friends described her as the emotional heart of the group, someone who kept morale high with jokes and songs. Her diary entries reflect her personality: warm, engaged, observant. She recorded details about their progress and the conditions they faced. When her body was found, she was one of the 4 with severe injuries, adding another layer of tragedy to her death. The 2 Yuris Doroshenko and Krivonishenko died together at the cedar tree, having attempted to build a fire to survive. Their efforts to create warmth in impossible conditions show both determination and the fundamental challenge they faced. Starting a fire with numb fingers in extreme cold, with inadequate fuel and poor shelter, would have been desperately difficult. That they tried shows they hadn't given up. That they failed shows how insurmountable their situation was. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member, had survived World War II combat, had lived through experiences that killed millions of his countrymen. He'd survived battles, starvation, winter retreats, all the horrors of the Eastern Front. To survive all that and then die on a mountain slope in peacetime adds bitter irony to his death. His wartime experience, which should have been an asset in survival situations, wasn't enough. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol's unusual surname, his French ancestry in Russia, makes him stand out in the group. But to his friends, he was simply Collier, another experienced hiker, another enthusiastic outdoorsman. His skull fracture suggests he suffered significant trauma at some point, possibly early in the sequence of events. Whether this injury impaired his ability to survive or occurred as he was already dying, we cannot know. Rustam Slobodin and Alexander Kolovatov have sometimes received less attention than others in the group, their deaths overshadowed by the more dramatic injuries of some victims or the leadership role of others. But they were real people, with their own lives and personalities, their own contributions to the group. Their deaths were no less tragic for receiving less individual attention. The family's grief was compounded by the mystery. Not knowing what happened meant they couldn't fully process or understand their losses. They were left with questions that couldn't be answered, scenarios that couldn't be resolved. The authorities' classification of the investigation added insult to injury. Losing a child is devastating. Having the circumstances classified as secret compounds the pain. Yuri Yudin's survival came with its own burden. He lived the rest of his life knowing that a decision to turn back early, a decision caused by illness, not choice, had saved him while his friends died. Survivor guilt is common in such circumstances. Yudin spoke often about his lost friends, keeping their memory alive, helping researchers understand who these people were beyond just names in a mystery. The memorial on the mountain honors the 9 who died there. It's a simple monument, appropriate for the remote location. Hikers who reach it often spend time there in reflection, contemplating the tragedy, perhaps saying a prayer, or simply acknowledging the lives lost. The memorial serves as a focal point for grief and remembrance, a physical marker of loss in the wilderness. Photographs of the hikers show vital young people full of energy and life. They smile in pictures from the expedition's early days, clearly enjoying themselves, clearly looking forward to the adventure ahead. These images, frozen in time, show them as they were before tragedy, happy, healthy, alive. The contrast with their fate makes the photographs poignant and difficult to view. Some families eventually found a kind of peace. They could never have answers to all questions, never know exactly what their loved ones experienced in their final hours, but they could remember them as they had been in life, vibrant, capable, loving. The manner of death, while tragic and mysterious, didn't define these 9 people's lives. They had been more than victims of an unsolved mystery. The academic and professional futures cut short represent another dimension of loss. These were educated, skilled, young people who would have contributed to Soviet society. What discoveries might they have made? What families might they have raised? What experiences might they have had? Death always involves lost potential, but death at such young ages makes that loss particularly acute. Friends of the victims have spoken over the years about the impact of the deaths. Losing 9 people from a close-knit community creates a hole that never quite fills. Other members of the hiking club continued their outdoor activities, but always with awareness of what had happened to their friends. The tragedy cast a shadow over the club and over the lives of those who knew the victims. As decades passed and the victims' contemporaries aged and died, the human element risked being lost to abstraction. The 9 became entries in a mystery, subjects of theories, topics of investigation, efforts to keep their actual humanity visible, to remember them as people, not just as victims, become increasingly important as direct memory of them fades. This is perhaps the truest tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Not the unsolved mystery, not the competing theories, not the decades of investigation. The tragedy is that 9 young people with full lives ahead of them died on a mountain slope, terrified and freezing, far from home, in circumstances that left so many questions unanswered. The mystery makes the deaths memorable, but the deaths themselves are the loss that truly matters. Over 60 years have passed since 9 hikers died on a Siberian mountainside. Many mysteries fade with time, evidence deteriorates, witnesses die, public interest wanes, new mysteries emerge to capture attention. But the Dyatlov Pass incident has not faded. If anything, interest has intensified as decades passed. Why does this particular tragedy maintain such a hold on public imagination? Part of the answer lies in the fundamental paradox at the heart of the case. The hikers did something that makes no rational sense. They fled their only shelter into lethal cold while inadequately dressed. This apparent irrationality attracts attention. If they died from getting lost or from equipment failure or from being caught in a storm, the case would be unfortunate but understandable. The incomprehensible choice to leave the tent is what makes the case persistently mysterious. The evidence itself is frustratingly ambiguous. We have enough information to know something unusual happened, but not enough to determine what. We have injuries that suggest massive force, but no mechanism for that force. We have reports of strange lights, but no confirmation of what they were. We have radiation, but not at levels suggesting nuclear events. The evidence points in many directions without clearly indicating any single explanation. This ambiguity creates space for imagination. People can project their own theories onto the case because no theory is definitively disproven. If you believe in military cover-ups, the classified files suggest military involvement. If you're interested in natural phenomena, Avalanche or Infrasound seem plausible. If you're drawn to exotic explanations, the strangeness invites speculation. The case becomes a kind of Rorschach test, revealing more about the theorist than about the actual events. The Cold War context adds layers of intrigue. The Soviet Union was secretive, conducted activities it didn't acknowledge, had military programs the public knew nothing about. The classification of the investigation fits this pattern. Whether or not the military was actually involved, the context makes military involvement seem plausible. The historical setting amplifies the mystery rather than diminishing it. The number of victims matters too. If one person had died mysteriously, it might be dismissed as a bizarre individual tragedy. If all 9 had died the same way from a single, obvious cause, it would be a disaster, but not a mystery. 9 people dying in different ways from different specific causes, but all stemming from the same mysterious event, creates a complex pattern that demands explanation. The quality of the victims experienced outdoors people, not novices, makes their apparent poor decisions more puzzling. If this were a group of inexperienced tourists making fatal mistakes, it would be sad but comprehensible. But these were people who knew winter mountains, knew cold weather survival, understood the dangers. Their experience makes their flight into the cold more paradoxical and more attention-grabbing. The remote location adds to the mystique. This didn't happen in a city or even near civilization. It happened in true wilderness, in conditions most people never experience. The isolation, the extreme cold, the darkness, the vast empty landscape, all these create an atmosphere of elemental confrontation between humans and nature. The setting itself becomes part of the story's appeal. The photographs from the expedition create powerful emotional connection. We see the hikers alive, smiling, energetic, clearly enjoying their adventure. These aren't abstract victims, they're real people whose faces we've seen, whose lives we glimpse through their diary entries and photographs. This personal connection makes the mystery more engaging than if we only had names and facts. The cultural moment matters too. The Dyatlov incident occurred at a time when the Cold War was intensifying, when space race and nuclear competition dominated headlines, when the future seemed both exciting and frightening. The incident resonates with Cold War-era anxieties about secrecy, government power, technological danger. It's a Cold War mystery in a way that gives it particular cultural resonance. The endurance of the mystery challenges our assumptions about solvability. We live in an age of forensic science, computer analysis, exhaustive investigation. We're accustomed to mysteries being solved, crimes being solved, questions being answered. The Dyatlov Pass incident resists this expectation. Despite decades of investigation by competent people with access to evidence, no consensus has emerged. This resistance to solution is itself fascinating. The case also touches on deep fears. Fear of cold and exposure is primal. We understand viscerally how dangerous freezing is. Fear of wilderness and isolation resonates with ancient human anxieties about leaving safety and venturing into unknown territory. Fear of the inexplicable taps into our discomfort with phenomena we cannot understand or control. The case engages multiple levels of human anxiety. The internet has given the mystery new life. Before global digital communication, the Dyatlov Pass incident was largely unknown outside Russia and among specialists in unsolved mysteries. The internet has made it globally famous. Forums, websites, videos, and social media spread information and theories worldwide. Each new person who encounters the case potentially contributes to keeping it alive and visible. The case has become self-perpetuating in some ways. New investigators approach it because previous investigators failed to solve it. The mystery itself becomes the reason for continued investigation. The case's fame attracts attention, and attention generates more investigation, and investigation generates more theories, and theories generate more attention. The cycle sustains itself. There's something psychologically satisfying about engaging with an unsolvable mystery. It provides intellectual stimulation without the pressure of actually needing to reach a conclusion. You can propose theories, debate evidence, consider possibilities, all without the burden of proof or professional responsibility. The mystery becomes a kind of game, serious but consequence-free for those not personally connected to the victims. The case also appeals to our desire for meaning. Random tragedy is harder to accept than tragedy with explanation. If the hikers died simply from a series of unfortunate circumstances and poor decisions, that's unsatisfying. It suggests life is more random and meaningless than we'd prefer. But if there's a mysterious cause, something specific that explains the deaths, that provides a kind of meaning, even if the meaning is tragic, perhaps most fundamentally, the case endures because the questions it raises are genuinely important. What makes people make catastrophic decisions? How do we investigate when evidence is ambiguous? When should we accept that answers are unavailable? These aren't just questions about one hiking tragedy, they're questions about human nature, investigation, knowledge, and certainty. The case becomes a vehicle for exploring larger questions. The mystery's endurance also reflects respect for the victims. Keeping the case alive means keeping their memory alive. Continuing to investigate means refusing to forget them, refusing to let their deaths become just another forgotten tragedy. The persistent attention is a form of memorial, a way of saying these 9 people mattered, their deaths mattered, and the questions surrounding their deaths deserve continued consideration. Ultimately, the Dyatlov Pass incident endures because it combines genuine tragedy with genuine mystery. The human cost is real and moving. The circumstances are authentically strange. The evidence is substantial but ambiguous. The questions are compelling. All these factors together create a mystery that resists resolution while inviting engagement. As long as people are interested in unsolved puzzles, as long as the questions remain unanswered, the case will continue to fascinate. We began this journey promising to explore one of the 20th century's most perplexing mysteries. We've examined the evidence, considered the theories, contemplated the human tragedy. We've walked in our imagination down that mountainside in the darkness and cold, trying to understand what drove 9 experienced people to make choices that doomed them. And still, despite everything we've explored, the central questions remain unanswered. What happened on Dyatlov Pass on the night of February 1st, 1959? We know some facts with certainty. 9 hikers fled their tent, inadequately dressed into lethal cold. They attempted to survive using their skills and available resources. All 9 died of hypothermia, though 4 also suffered severe traumatic injuries. These facts are established. Everything else is interpretation, theory, speculation. The theories we've examined each account for some evidence while struggling with other evidence. Avalanche explains sudden flight, but doesn't match the site conditions or fully explain the injuries. Military involvement explains secrecy and strange lights but lacks concrete evidence. Infrasound explains irrational behavior but not the severe trauma. Natural explanations seem too mundane for such a strange event. Exotic explanations seem too unlikely despite the strangeness. We're left without a fully satisfying answer. Perhaps this is the lesson the Dyatlov Pass incident teaches us. Not all questions have clear answers. Not all mysteries can be solved. Not all tragedies can be fully understood. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite thorough investigation and careful analysis, despite modern technology and determined research, certainty eludes us. Sometimes, we must live with ambiguity. This is uncomfortable for us. We want closure. We want to know what happened. We want to understand why 9 young people died. We want the story to have a clear ending, an explanation that accounts for all evidence, a solution that resolves all questions. But the universe doesn't always provide what we want. Sometimes events unfold in ways that leave ambiguous traces. Sometimes evidence is insufficient. Sometimes we simply cannot know. The question becomes, how do we respond to this uncertainty? Do we keep investigating, hoping that new evidence or new approaches might crack the case? Do we accept that answers may never come and make peace with mystery? Do we settle on the most plausible explanation even if it doesn't perfectly fit all evidence? Different people and institutions make different choices. The Russian authorities' 2020 conclusion favored Avalanche choosing the most conventional explanation that accounts for major evidence, even though it doesn't explain everything perfectly. This reflects a pragmatic approach. In the absence of certainty, choose the explanation requiring fewest exotic assumptions. It's a reasonable position, though it satisfies few people who've deeply studied the case. Other researchers continue investigating, convinced that the answer exists and sufficient effort will reveal it. They re-examine old evidence, apply new techniques, propose new theories. This reflects an admirable refusal to give up, a commitment to seeking truth, no matter how elusive. But it also risks becoming an obsession, a quest that can never be completed, because the goal may be unreachable. Perhaps the wisest response is to hold the mystery lightly, to remain interested and engaged but not consumed, to consider new evidence and theories but not become dogmatic about any explanation, to honor the victims by remembering them while accepting that the full truth of their deaths may remain unknown. This balanced approach acknowledges both the value of investigation and the possibility of ultimate uncertainty. The 9 hikers deserve to be remembered not just as a mystery but as real people who lived real lives. They were students and workers, friends and family members, people with dreams and plans and daily concerns. They went on a hiking trip, an adventure they'd done before and expected to complete successfully. That their trip ended in tragedy and mystery doesn't define their entire existence. They were more than victims. They were people. For their families and friends, the mystery added an extra burden to grief. Not knowing exactly what happened, living with questions that couldn't be answered, dealing with speculation and theories about their loved ones, all of this compounded the pain of loss. Perhaps for them, the investigation and continued attention was comforting, a sign that their family members hadn't been forgotten. Or perhaps it was torture, preventing them from achieving closure and moving forward with their lives. Yuri Yudin, the survivor, lived with the weight of his survival. His illness that forced him to turn back saved his life, but condemned him to decades of wondering what happened to his friends, fielding questions, being the sole survivor who had to carry the memory. His perspective was unique and valuable, but it came at tremendous personal cost. When he died in 2012, a direct link to the events was lost. The site on Dyatlov Pass remains. The snow still falls there each winter. Wind still howls across the exposed slope. Cold still grips the landscape with lethal intensity. Hikers still trek through the area, some specifically to visit the place where 9 young people died. The memorial stands as testament to tragedy and loss. The mountain, indifferent to human stories, endures as it has for millions of years. Perhaps future investigation will reveal new evidence or provide new insights that finally solve the mystery. Perhaps someone will discover documents that clarify what happened. Perhaps new technology will allow analysis that wasn't previously possible. Or perhaps the case will remain forever unresolved, a permanent mystery, a question without an answer, a tragedy whose full truth remains hidden. Either way, the case reminds us of important truths. Human understanding has limits. Investigation doesn't always bring certainty. Mysteries can be genuine and persistent. The universe doesn't always make sense in ways we can comprehend. And 9 young people on a winter hiking trip in 1959 died in circumstances so strange that over 60 years later, we still cannot fully explain what happened. As we close this exploration, we're left with the same questions we started with. What drove the hikers from their tent? What caused the severe injuries? What was the compelling unknown force that took 9 lives? We've examined evidence, considered theories, explored every angle we can, and still the answers elude us. The mystery persists. The questions remain. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some tragedies are meant to remain mysterious. Some questions are meant to stay unanswered. Some stories are meant to be incomplete. The 9 hikers on Dyatlov Pass have become part of history not because we understand what happened to them, but precisely because we don't. Their deaths have become one of those rare events that defy explanation, that resist our attempts to categorize and understand, that remain forever at the edge of comprehension. They ventured into the wilderness seeking adventure. They found instead a cold and lonely death under circumstances we still cannot fully explain. Their bodies were recovered, but their story remains incomplete. The mountain where they died still stands, silent and indifferent, keeping whatever secrets it may hold. And we, decades later, still wonder what happened on that dark February night in the northern Urals. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass endures. The questions persist. The 9 hikers are not forgotten, and the mountain, patient and eternal, waits under its blanket of snow, holding whatever truth it witnessed on that fatal night, offering no answers to those who seek them, remaining as mysterious as the tragedy it hosted over 60 years ago. The search operation itself deserves closer examination, as it reveals both the challenges of wilderness search and the determination of those seeking the missing hikers. The first search teams consisted of volunteers from the hiking club, people who knew the missing hikers personally, who understood their capabilities, who felt personally invested in finding them. These weren't professional rescue workers conducting a routine operation. These were friends searching for friends. Imagine the psychological burden on these searchers. Every day spent searching without results increased the likelihood that their friends were dead. The harsh conditions that made searching difficult were the same conditions that would be killing the people they sought. Hope and despair warred within them. They had to maintain focus and discipline while dealing with fear and growing certainty of tragedy. The military's involvement brought additional resources, but also introduced bureaucratic complexity. Military search operations followed protocols and hierarchies. Orders had to be given and followed. Coordination between military and civilian searchers had to be established. Some friction was inevitable between the structured military approach and the more flexible civilian search efforts. But both groups shared the goal of finding the missing hikers. Aircraft searches faced significant limitations. From the air, Even a bright-colored tent could be difficult to spot against snow. The tent was partially buried by wind-driven snow accumulation. Trees obscured the forest areas where some bodies were eventually found. Weather frequently grounded aircraft, limiting flight time. And even when aircraft could fly, the vast territory that had to be covered meant that spotting small targets was more luck than certainty. Ground searchers used probe poles to search for buried bodies or equipment under snow. This is exhausting, tedious work. Push a pole into snow, pull it out, move a step, repeat thousands of times. You might probe all day without finding anything. The searchers' hands would become numb despite gloves. Their backs would ache from the constant bending. But they persisted because somewhere under that snow were 9 people who needed to be found. The discovery of the tent on February 26th was both a breakthrough and a source of new concern. Finding the tent confirmed the searchers were in the right area, but the tent's condition damaged, abandoned, with the trail of footprints leading away made clear that something had gone badly wrong. The hope that the hikers might be found alive, sheltering somewhere, essentially evaporated at that moment. Forensic examination of the tent site provided crucial information but also raised questions. The tent had been deliberately cut from inside. Why? The entrance was accessible, they could have exited normally. Was there some obstacle or danger at the entrance that required cutting a new exit? Or was the cutting done in panic without rational thought? The cuts themselves were examined for what they might reveal about timing and decision-making. Inside the tent, the arrangement of equipment and personal items suggested the hikers had been settled for the night. Some were apparently in their sleeping bags when something happened. Others might have been still awake, perhaps on watch or dealing with equipment. The cameras found in the tent were eventually developed, showing photographs from earlier in the trip, but nothing that explained what happened on the fatal night. The footprints leading away from the tent told their own story. Investigators photographed and measured them carefully. 8 or 9 people walking mostly in single file, heading generally downslope toward the forest. The spacing suggested organized retreat, not panicked flight, but the inadequate footwear made clear that whatever drove them from the tent, it drove them to make choices that would doom them. Following the footprint trail down the slope, searchers must have experienced growing horror. With each step down the mountain, they were moving toward where the hikers had gone, toward wherever the bodies might be. The trail led inexorably toward the forest, toward the cedar tree where the first bodies would be found. Walking that trail, searchers were retracing the last journey of 9 doomed people. The discovery of the first 2 bodies at the cedar tree was devastating, but not surprising by that point. Searchers had understood that finding anyone alive was no longer possible. But seeing the bodies, the frozen forms of people who'd been alive just weeks before, who'd been friends, who'd been young and healthy and full of life, made the tragedy concrete and immediate. The emotional impact on the searchers was severe. The attempts to build a fire that the 2 Urals had made showed their desperation and their determination. With numb fingers, in extreme cold, they'd gathered what fuel they could find and attempted to create warmth. The fact that they'd succeeded in starting a fire showed both skill and determination. The fact that the fire hadn't saved them showed how insufficient their preparations were for survival in those conditions. The cedar tree itself became a crucial piece of evidence. Branches broken off up to 5 meters high suggested someone had climbed the tree. Why? Perhaps trying to see back to the tent, trying to determine if it was safe to return, perhaps looking for an escape route or surveying the terrain, perhaps simply climbing in desperation, doing something active rather than passively freezing. The broken branches told of effort and hope and ultimately futility. Finding the 3 bodies on the slope between the cedar and the tent revealed that some hikers had attempted to return. They'd realized their mistake. They'd understood that shelter and proper clothing were at the tent, and that survival required getting back to those resources. But the cold had been too much. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and the struggle to move uphill through deep snow had defeated them. They died trying to save themselves. The positions of these three bodies told individual stories. Dyatlov had grabbed a branch, trying to pull himself higher. His frozen hand still clutched it when found. This detail, the hand frozen in the act of pulling, made the tragedy visceral. He'd been trying to the very end, still fighting to survive even as his body shut down from cold. His determination in his final moments was both admirable and heartbreaking. The forensic examination process deserves detailed attention, as the autopsy findings are central to understanding the mystery. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, the medical examiner, had to work with bodies that had been frozen for weeks or months. This complicates forensic analysis. Frozen tissue behaves differently than fresh tissue. Some injuries might have occurred post-mortem as bodies were handled or transported. Some damage might be from decomposition rather than trauma. The external examination of each body was thorough. Every injury was documented, photographed, and described. The clothing on each body was examined and catalogued. The positions in which bodies were found were recorded. This methodical documentation created a record that subsequent researchers could analyze, even decades later. The photographs, while disturbing, provided permanent evidence of the body's conditions. The internal examination, the autopsy proper, revealed the condition of organs, bones, and soft tissues. For the first 5 bodies found, the autopsies showed what was expected: hypothermia as cause of death, with predictable associated findings. The bodies showed the physiological effects of dying from cold, certain characteristic changes in organs and tissues that forensic pathologists recognize as indicating hypothermia. But the 4 bodies found in May presented a different picture. The external examination showed relatively intact clothing, suggesting they'd been better dressed than the others. Some clothing items were identified as having come from the 2 Urals found at the cedar tree, confirming that these 4 had survived long enough to take clothing from the dead. This indicated a survival timeline. The 2 Urals died first. These 4 took their clothing, then eventually died themselves. The internal examination of these 4 bodies revealed the troubling injuries that would become central to the mystery: fractured ribs, major chest trauma, skull fracture, missing soft tissue. Dr. Vozrojdeny's notes described these injuries in technical medical language, but the implications were clear. These people had suffered significant trauma from some kind of force. The force required to break ribs in the pattern seen in Dubinina and Zolotaryov is substantial. Ribs are strong, flexible bones designed to protect vital organs. Breaking multiple ribs on both sides requires impact force comparable to car crashes or falls from height. The medical examiner specifically noted that the force couldn't have come from human punches or kicks. Something with much greater energy had struck them. The distribution of injuries was puzzling. Why did 4 people have severe trauma, while 5 had only minor injuries consistent with stumbling through forest in the dark? This distribution suggests 2 separate events or mechanisms. The 5 with minor injuries died from exposure after fleeing the tent. The 4 with severe injuries apparently suffered some additional trauma at the ravine before also dying of exposure. The missing tongue and facial tissue in Dubinina's case has been sensationalized in many accounts of the incident, but forensic pathologists note that soft tissue in the mouth and face is often among the first to decompose or be scavenged. Bodies left exposed for months, especially if partially submerged in water as these were in the spring snowmelt, often show this kind of tissue loss. It might not indicate pre-mortem violence at all. However, the medical examiner's notes about the tongue are ambiguous enough to leave questions. Was the tongue definitely removed by natural processes, or could it have been traumatic injury? The report doesn't make this entirely clear, allowing for multiple interpretations. This ambiguity has fueled decades of speculation about what caused this particular injury. The toxicology results were largely unremarkable. No evidence of alcohol or drugs that might have impaired judgment. No evidence of poisons or unusual substances. The blood chemistry showed changes consistent with hypothermia, but nothing suggesting poisoning or exposure to chemical weapons. The hikers died sober and clear-headed, which makes their decisions all the more puzzling. The avalanche theory deserves the most thorough examination of all natural explanations, as it represents the official conclusion of the 2020 Russian investigation. Understanding why authorities favor this explanation and why many researchers remain skeptical requires examining both the evidence supporting the theory and the problems it faces. Avalanche mechanics are complex. Snow accumulates on slopes in layers, each layer with different properties depending on when it fell, how wind deposited it, what the temperature was during and after deposition. Weak layers can form beneath stronger layers, creating instability. Weight from new snow, changes in temperature, vibration from movement or sound, all can trigger avalanche when conditions are right. The specific type of avalanche proposed in the 2019 scientific study is what's called a delayed slab avalanche. In this scenario, the hikers cut into the slope to create a flat tent platform. This cutting weakened the snowpack. Wind during the evening deposited additional snow above their tent. Hours later, perhaps after midnight, the accumulated stress caused a slab of snow to break loose and slide down onto the tent. Computer modeling suggested that such an avalanche could generate sufficient force to cause the chest injuries seen in some victims. The model showed that even a relatively small slab avalanche could create localized pressure sufficient to break ribs. This would explain injuries without requiring exotic causes. It would also explain why the hikers fled immediately they'd just been hit by an avalanche and feared more might come. But critics of this theory point to significant problems. First, the slope angle. Avalanche risk generally requires slopes between 30 and 45 degrees. The Dyatlov Pass slope is less than 30 degrees below the typical avalanche threshold. While avalanches can occasionally occur on gentler slopes, it's unusual enough that experienced mountaineers wouldn't normally consider the site high risk. Second, when searchers found the tent, it was still standing and properly anchored. An avalanche forceful enough to break ribs should have destroyed or buried the tent. The tent showed cuts and wind damage, but no signs of avalanche impact. The snow accumulation around it looked normal for wind deposition, not consistent with avalanche debris. Third, the footprints leading away from the tent were clearly visible when searchers arrived 3 weeks later. An avalanche would have obliterated or buried these prints. The fact that they were visible and could be followed suggests no major snow movement occurred in that area after the hikers left. Fourth, if avalanche was the threat, the logical response would be to move laterally across the slope to safe ground, perhaps descending slightly to get out of any avalanche path. Instead, the hikers went straight down the slope for over a kilometer until they reached the forest. This seems excessive if simple avalanche avoidance was the goal. Fifth, the injuries occurred to only 4 people, and those injuries appear to have happened at the ravine, not at the tent. If an avalanche hit the tent and injured some people, you'd expect the injuries to occur there and immediately. The pattern suggests the 4 with severe injuries experienced trauma later, after reaching the ravine, not during the initial flight from the tent. The 2019 study attempted to address some objections by proposing a very specific type of avalanche under very particular conditions. But critics note that the more specific and conditional a theory becomes, the more unlikely it is. If you need a precise combination of rare circumstances to make a theory work, is it really the most probable explanation? Supporters of the avalanche theory argue that it's the most parsimonious explanation requiring the fewest exotic assumptions. Avalanches happen. They can cause injuries. They would cause people to flee. Yes, there are problems with the specific application to Dyatlov Pass, but these might be explained by gaps in our understanding or by specific local conditions we can't reconstruct decades later. The debate over avalanche essentially becomes a question of what you're willing to assume. Are the problems with the theory fatal to the explanation, Or are they just details that require additional research or acceptance of uncertainty? Different researchers reach different conclusions based on how they weigh the evidence and what probability thresholds they use for accepting explanations. The psychological aspects of the Dyatlov Pass incident deserve deeper exploration, as understanding human behavior under extreme stress might illuminate what happened that night. When people face life-threatening situations, their decision-making can become impaired. Panic, cold, exhaustion, fear all affect judgment and can lead to choices that seem irrational in retrospect but made sense in the moment to the people experiencing them. Research on survival psychology shows that even trained, experienced people can make poor decisions under sufficient stress. The freeze, fight, flight response is a fundamental human reaction to perceived threats. When that response activates, rational thought diminishes. The primitive brain takes over, focused solely on immediate survival without considering long-term consequences. This might explain why experienced hikers would flee shelter into lethal cold in that moment. The immediate perceived threat dominated their thinking. Group dynamics add another layer of complexity. 9 people don't make decisions independently, they influence each other. If one person panics and flees, others might follow even if they don't fully understand why. Leadership matters tremendously. If Igor Dyatlov made a decision to evacuate the tent, the others would likely have followed his lead without questioning. A single poor decision by a trusted leader can doom an entire group. The concept of normalcy bias might be relevant. People tend to underestimate threats and assume situations will develop normally even when warning signs suggest otherwise. If something unusual was happening, strange sounds, unusual weather, uncertain conditions, the hikers might have initially dismissed concerns, believing things would be fine. By the time they realized the situation was genuinely dangerous, they might have been already committed to poor decisions. Cold itself affects cognition. As body temperature drops even slightly below normal, mental functioning deteriorates. Decision-making becomes impaired. Judgment fails. People become confused, irritable, unable to think clearly. If the hikers were already becoming hypothermic before they even left the tent, perhaps from inadequate insulation or heat loss through the tent fabric, their mental state might have been compromised from the start. The darkness cannot be underestimated as a factor. This was February in the northern Urals. The night would have been nearly absolute in its blackness. No moon visible through cloud and blowing snow, no stars, no artificial light for hundreds of kilometers. Once away from the tent, they would have been navigating by feel and instinct through snow and forest in darkness so complete that you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. Disorientation would have been immediate and total. Sound in winter wilderness can play tricks on perception. Wind creates unusual noises, howling, roaring, whistling through trees and over terrain features. These sounds can seem threatening or otherworldly, especially when you're already anxious. Infrasound generated by wind can create physical sensations of unease, pressure, even pain. If the hikers were hearing and feeling unusual effects from wind-generated sound, this might have contributed to panic. The physical environment of the slope and forest is worth considering in detail. The slope where they camped was exposed, wind-blasted, accumulating snow continuously. Their tent was partially buried. Searchers found it under snow accumulation. Being inside that tent, hearing wind roar outside, feeling the tent flex and strain against the wind, would have been unsettling even for experienced campers. The tent would have been noisy, cold, despite the sleeping bags, and psychologically oppressive. The forest below represented safety in some ways, shelter from wind, fuel for fire, reference points for location. But reaching it required descending more than a kilometer through deep snow in the dark and cold. The distance seems survivable on paper. A kilometer is walkable in normal conditions in 10 or 15 minutes. But in deep snow, in darkness, in extreme cold, with inadequate clothing, that kilometer becomes nearly insurmountable. Each step would have been exhausting. Progress would have been agonizingly slow. The cedar tree where the two Urals died represents a crucial decision point. They reached the forest, found a substantial tree, gathered fuel, started a fire. These were rational survival actions. If they'd had proper clothing and more time, they might have survived through the night and attempted return to the tent at dawn, but they didn't have adequate clothing. The fire wasn't sufficient. The cold was overwhelming. Despite doing the right things for survival, they died anyway. The fact that 3 others attempted to return to the tent shows that not everyone lost all rational thought. At some point, perhaps when they reached the forest, perhaps later after the 2 Urals died, some members of the group realized they needed to get back to the tent and proper equipment. They started climbing back up the slope. This was the correct decision, but made too late and without adequate resources. They died trying to execute the right plan. The 4 found in the ravine present the most complex scenario. They'd survived longer than the others, suggesting they were better dressed or found better shelter, or were simply more physically resilient. They'd made it to the ravine, perhaps deliberately seeking its protection from wind. They'd attempted to create some kind of shelter, or at least a more protected position, but then they suffered the severe trauma that has puzzled investigators for decades. The ravine itself might hold clues. It was a natural feature carved by water flow during warmer seasons, filled with snow in winter. The snow depth there was measured at 4 meters, when the bodies were found deep enough to provide significant protection from wind, but also deep enough to create other dangers. Could there have been a snow collapse within the ravine? Could accumulated snow have created an unstable structure that collapsed on the 4 hikers? This micro-avalanche or snow collapse theory doesn't require the major slope avalanche that has been debated. Instead, it suggests a localized collapse of accumulated snow within the ravine itself. 4 meters of snow represents enormous weight. If layered snow within the ravine became unstable and collapsed, it could generate tremendous force over a small area. This might explain injuries without requiring exotic causes. The pattern of injuries, severe chest trauma without external wounds, is consistent with crushing pressure rather than blunt impact. If the 4 were partially buried by collapsing snow, the pressure on their chests could break ribs without causing external injuries. Snow pressure is distributed rather than concentrated, crushing rather than striking. This mechanism fits the forensic evidence better than many alternative theories. The timeline of events matters tremendously, but remains uncertain. We know the hikers left the tent on the night of February 1st. We know the 2 Urals died at the cedar tree. We know 3 died attempting to return to the tent. We know 4 died in the ravine, but we don't know the exact sequence or timing. Did everyone survive hours? Did some die quickly? The physical evidence can't definitively establish the timeline. If we assume the coldest part of the night was after midnight, and that's when they left the tent, survival times would have been limited. In extreme cold with inadequate clothing, a person might survive 1 to 3 hours before hypothermia becomes fatal. This suggests all 9 probably died within a few hours of leaving the tent. The sun would have risen over bodies that were already frozen. The searchers who found the bodies weeks or months later were seeing the end result of a tragedy that had unfolded over just a few hours on one February night. Those hours from whenever they fled the tent until the last person died contained all the answers to what happened. But we have only the evidence left behind, not the experience of living through those hours. We see the result, but not the process. Modern survival training and outdoor education have learned from the Dyatlov Pass incident and similar tragedies. The fundamental lesson is simple. Shelter is survival in extreme cold. Never abandon adequate shelter unless the shelter itself is the immediate threat. If you must abandon shelter, take maximum clothing and equipment. Move to the nearest alternative shelter, not indefinitely away. Stay together as a group. These principles seem obvious but become critical in life or death situations. The incident has also informed search and rescue procedures. When winter hikers are overdue, searches begin quickly and systematically. Aircraft and ground teams coordinate carefully. High priority is given to known shelters, trails, and likely routes. Modern communication technology, GPS, satellite phones, emergency beacons, has made wilderness safety much better, though not perfect. People still die in winter wilderness, but we've learned to reduce the risk. The legal and ethical questions around the investigation have also been debated. Did Soviet authorities conduct the investigation properly? Was evidence handled correctly? Were all relevant tests performed? The classification of the files raises questions about transparency, but examination of the released files suggests the investigation was reasonably thorough by standards of the time. The mystery isn't from incompetent investigation, but from genuinely ambiguous evidence. The international dimension of the case is worth noting. While the incident occurred in the Soviet Union and primarily affected Soviet citizens, it has become a global mystery. Researchers from many countries have studied the case, proposed theories, conducted independent analysis. The internet has made this international collaboration possible, allowing people worldwide to contribute to understanding what happened. The case has also highlighted limitations of forensic science. Even with bodies, physical evidence, scene documentation, and thorough investigation, we cannot always determine exactly what happened. Forensic science is powerful but not omniscient. Ambiguous evidence yields ambiguous conclusions. This is frustrating but reflects the reality of evidence-based investigation. Sometimes we simply don't have enough information to be certain. The emotional legacy of the Dyatlov Pass incident extends beyond the families directly affected. It has touched everyone who has seriously engaged with the case, researchers who've spent years studying it, writers who've attempted to explain it, documentary filmmakers who've explored it, casual observers who've read about it. The case has a way of haunting people, of creating a sense of connection to 9 people who died long ago in circumstances we cannot fully explain. Perhaps this emotional impact explains the case's endurance as much as the mystery itself. We feel for these 9 young people. We imagine ourselves in their position. We wonder how we would have responded to whatever crisis they faced. We hope we would have made better decisions, survived where they died. But we also recognize that in extreme circumstances, any of us might make fatal errors. The tragedy is both extraordinary and universal. The mountain itself remains. Kolatsiakal, Dead Mountain in the Mansi language, continues to stand in the northern Urals as it has for millions of years. Seasons cycle through it. Snow falls each winter and melts each spring. Wind blows continuously across its slopes. It is utterly indifferent to human tragedy, to human investigation, to human attempts to understand what happened on its slopes in 1959. The mountain holds no answers because mountains don't hold answers. They simply exist, and we project meaning onto them. Future generations will likely continue investigating the Dyatlov Pass incident. New technologies will be applied. New theories will be proposed. Perhaps someday someone will find the key piece of evidence that solves the mystery. Or perhaps the case will remain forever uncertain, a permanent fixture in the catalogue of unsolved historical events. Either way, the 9 hikers will be remembered, the questions will persist, and people will continue to wonder what really happened on that cold February night. The lesson, perhaps, is that not all stories have endings. Not all questions have answers. Not all mysteries can be solved. 9 young people went hiking in the mountains and died under circumstances that remain unclear despite decades of investigation. This is tragic, frustrating, and ultimately mysterious. And maybe that's all we can definitively say, that something happened on Dyatlov Pass that we still don't fully understand, and that 9 lives were lost in ways that continue to puzzle us over 60 years later. Examining other winter wilderness tragedies provides important context for understanding the Dyatlov Pass incident. While each tragedy is unique, patterns emerge when you study multiple cases of people dying from exposure in cold environments. These patterns can help us understand what might have happened on Dyatlov Pass and why experienced outdoors people sometimes make fatal decisions. The 1996 Mount Everest disaster, popularized by John Krakauer's book Into Thin Air, shows how experienced climbers can die despite knowledge and preparation. 8 people died on Everest during a single storm, including highly experienced guides. The combination of altitude, weather, exhaustion, and time pressure created a situation where even experts made poor decisions. The lesson: expertise doesn't guarantee survival when conditions become extreme enough. The 1972 Andes flight disaster, where a plane crashed in the mountains and survivors endured months before rescue, demonstrates human resilience, but also shows how people adapt to desperate situations. The survivors made difficult decisions, including eventually consuming the flesh of deceased passengers in order to stay alive. The lesson: survival sometimes requires doing things that would be unthinkable in normal circumstances. The 2011 tragedy on Mont Blanc, where 9 climbers died in a sudden storm despite being experienced mountaineers, shows how weather can overwhelm even well-prepared groups. The storm came quickly. Visibility dropped to nothing. Temperatures plunged. The climbers became disoriented and separated. Some fell to their deaths. Others died of exposure. The lesson: weather in mountains can change so rapidly that there's no time to retreat to safety. The 1996 blizzard in the Cairngorms in Scotland killed 4 experienced winter climbers. They were caught in unexpectedly severe weather, became hypothermic, made poor decisions about where to seek shelter, and died despite being relatively close to safety. The lesson: even in relatively accessible mountains, winter conditions can be lethal when judgment becomes impaired by cold and exhaustion. What these cases share with Dyatlov Pass is the element of sudden deterioration. In each case, experienced people facing difficult but manageable conditions suddenly encountered a situation that became catastrophically dangerous. The transition from challenging but okay to life-threatening can happen very quickly in wilderness environments, faster than people can respond effectively. The psychological phenomenon known as summit fever in mountaineering might have relevance to Dyatlov Pass. Summit fever describes the obsessive focus on reaching a goal even when continuing has become clearly dangerous. Climbers who should turn back instead push forward, convinced that giving up represents failure. While the Dyatlov hikers weren't summiting a peak, they did have a goal reaching Otorten Mountain and pressure to complete their planned expedition. Could goal-oriented thinking have influenced their decisions? The concept of committed error is also relevant. Once you've made a decision and begun acting on it, humans show strong psychological resistance to changing course, even when evidence suggests the decision was wrong. If the Dyatlov hikers decided to leave the tent for what seemed like good reason, they might have been psychologically committed to that decision, unwilling to reverse course immediately even when the error became apparent. Group psychology research shows that groups can collectively make worse decisions than individuals would make alone. Groupthink, where desire for consensus overrides careful evaluation of alternatives, can lead to catastrophic choices. If someone in the Dyatlov group suggested leaving the tent, others might have agreed without adequate consideration, each assuming other group members had good reason to support the decision. The bystander effect, usually studied in urban contexts, might also apply. In groups, individuals sometimes fail to take action, assuming someone else will handle the situation. If each member of the Dyatlov group assumed someone else understood why they were leaving the tent, no one might have questioned the decision explicitly. By the time anyone realized no one actually understood what was happening, they were already committed to a fatal course of action. Communication failures can also be fatal in wilderness emergencies. If the hikers fled the tent in response to some threat, did they communicate clearly about what the threat was? Did everyone understand why they were leaving? Or did some people follow others without knowing what was happening? Inadequate communication in crisis situations can turn a manageable problem into a catastrophe. As people work at cross purposes or operate on different understandings of the situation. The concept of learned helplessness might explain why some hikers didn't attempt to return to the tent or didn't take more aggressive survival actions. If they felt that their situation was hopeless, that nothing they did would make a difference, they might have become passive, accepting death rather than fighting desperately for survival. This psychological state can develop quickly in extreme stress, overriding the survival instinct. Modern wilderness medicine and survival training has incorporated lessons from Dyatlov Pass and similar tragedies. The hierarchy of survival priorities, shelter, warmth, water, food, rescue, is taught systematically. The importance of staying together as a group, maintaining communication, making deliberate decisions rather than panic choices, all these principles are emphasized. Training scenarios often include decision-making under stress, specifically to prepare people for the kind of crisis situations that killed the Dyatlov hikers. The equipment available to modern wilderness travelers is vastly superior to what the Dyatlov hikers had. Synthetic insulation that works when wet, waterproof breathable fabrics, satellite communication devices, GPS navigation, emergency beacons that summon rescue automatically. All these technologies improve safety. But people still die in winter wilderness despite modern gear, because fundamentally the challenges are the same: cold, exposure, navigation, and human decision-making under stress. Perhaps the most important lesson from Dyatlov Pass is humility about our ability to survive in extreme environments. Humans evolved in tropical and temperate climates. We are not biologically adapted to extreme cold. We survive Siberian winters only through technology, clothing, shelter, heat sources. When that technology fails or is absent, we die quickly. The hikers' deaths weren't due to some exotic cause, but to simple exposure to conditions that humans cannot tolerate. Everything else, the mystery, the theories, the debates, exists around this fundamental fact. The case reminds us that nature is not malicious, but it is indifferent. The cold doesn't care about experience or preparation or good intentions. Wind doesn't care about goals or dreams. Mountains don't care about human hopes or fears. The northern Urals in winter are simply an environment where human survival requires careful attention to detail and adequate precautions. When something goes wrong, whatever went wrong on February 1st, 1959, nature provides no safety margin, no second chances, no forgiveness. The 9 hikers made mistakes or encountered circumstances beyond their control, and nature's indifference killed them. This understanding doesn't solve the mystery of what initially drove them from their tent. It doesn't explain the severe injuries or the paradoxes in their behavior. But it reminds us that the ultimate cause of death was simple exposure to an environment that humans cannot survive without protection. Whatever happened, the cold killed them. The mystery is what set the events in motion. The tragedy is that 9 young people died. The lesson is that wilderness demands respect, preparation, and luck, and sometimes even that isn't enough. As we close this exploration of the Dyatlov Pass incident, we carry with us an appreciation for both the mystery itself and the human lives at its center. 9 people, Igor, Zinaida, Lyudmila, the 2 Uris, Semyon, Nikolai, Rustem, and Alexander, went into the mountains and never returned. Their deaths created questions that persist over 60 years later. Whether those questions will ever be definitively answered remains uncertain, but the asking itself honors their memory and reminds us that some events in human history resist simple explanation, maintaining their mystery despite our best efforts to understand them. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as testament to both human vulnerability in nature and the enduring power of unsolved mystery. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. The Dyatlov Pass incident has haunted investigators, researchers, and interested observers for over 6 decades. Whether it will ever be fully explained remains to be seen. but the 9 young people who died on that Siberian mountainside deserve to be remembered not just as subjects of a mystery, but as real individuals whose lives were cut tragically short. If you found this exploration of the Dyatlov Pass incident compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you think happened on that mountain. Do you favor a natural explanation like Avalanche? Do you suspect military involvement? Do you have your own theory? Your engagement helps support these deep investigations into history's unsolved mysteries. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that some mysteries may never be solved, some questions may never be answered, and some events in human history will forever remain at the boundary between the known and the unknown. Good night.